All right, guys. Now, in the last lesson, we've set up our requests and responses to the GET requests and the POST requests on our home route. And by doing this, we're able to load up our sign up page with Bootstrap enabled, and we're able to send this data over to our servers using Body Parser. So now it's time to start incorporating our API. So if we Google for MailChimp API, then we get taken to developer.mailchimp.com. And this is the documentation for MailChimp's latest API, version 3.0. So we're going to go ahead and click Let's do this, and we're going to get started with the MailChimp API. Now, as they say here, in order to use the API, we need to get an API key to authenticate ourselves with their servers, because after all, you don't want some random person to start adding subscribers to your mailing list, right? And you definitely don't want somebody to just delete your entire mailing list by making post requests that are not authorized. So let's go ahead and set up our API key. Now, if you don't have a MailChimp account, then this is a good time to set one up. So if you go to MailChimp.com and you select sign up for free, then you can sign up to their service. It's completely free to sign up, and they don't require any credit card details to do so. Now, once you have signed up, then it's time to log in to the service. And you can grab your API key by going to your name, clicking the drop-down menu, going to Account, and then going to Extras and API Keys. And you can generate a new API key just by clicking on Create a Key. Now you have a brand new API key. So it's a little bit confusing for me because I've got so many here, but you should only have one. And then your key is simply this value over here, which you're going to copy and you're going to paste it into your app.js. And then we're going to simply comment this out because we're going to be using it a little bit later on. All right, so now that we've got our API key, then we're ready to interact with MailChimp's servers through their API. So if you head back to developer.mailchimp.com and head over to their documentation and their API reference, then we can use this as our instruction manual to figure out how to add subscribers to our list. So the first thing to do is to head over to the list section, and there's a number of things that you can do here. You can create, you can read, you can edit, and you can delete. Now we're interested in the creation part because we want to subscribe some list members. So I'm going to click on here, and I end up at this post route, which allows me to batch subscribe or unsubscribe list members. Now, the process is exactly the same if you want to batch subscribe lots of people or simply subscribe a single person. All you need is a list ID, and you can provide the members that you want to subscribe in the body of your request. So how do we do all of that? Well, first things first, let's get our list ID. So inside MailChimp, if you head over to lists, you can go ahead and create a new list. And once you've gone through this process of giving the list a name, a default from email address, and all of the things that they're going to insert into your emails, you'll see it show up in your list tab. And on this page, if you click on the drop-down menu on the right here, you can go over to the settings page. And if you scroll down, you'll see the unique ID for this list. And this is going to help MailChimp identify the list that you want to add or remove subscribers from. So let's go ahead and copy that and paste it down here in Atom as well. So now we've got our list ID and our API key, then we're pretty much equipped to start subscribing our members. Now, if you scroll down in this documentation, you can see that they provide an example request. So this is how you should be making requests, but they're showing it to you using curl, which is through the command line. Now, it's going to be slightly different for us because we're going to be using our server to make this request. But all the core parts are essentially the same. We still need to provide a base URL. We need to specify that our request method is the post method. And we need to give our API key in order to authorize our request. And finally, we're going to provide some pieces of data in our request body, and that includes the email address of the members that we want to sign up. So let's break this down a little bit so that we can fully understand what's going on here. Now, as we did before, we're going to go ahead and call our request function. Now, if you remember, the request function takes two parameters. The first one is going to be our list of options. And the second one is going to be a callback function that has three parameters, which is error, response, and body, which is the data that we get back. All right, so now that we've got our request written, it's time to create our options. So we're going to create the variable called options, and this is going to be an object, remember. And the object can take a number of arguments that you can pass in. But the most important is the URL that we're going to be making the request to. So that URL, in our case, looks something like this. And you can see that it's constructed from a number of things. So the last section here is the list ID. And the first part here specifies a particular data server. Now, MailChimp's APIs are used by people all over the world, and it's hit up thousands, if not millions of times every hour. So they have more than one location where their servers are residing. So you can spread the load of all these requests across all of these different servers. Now, the one that you get allocated depends on what you saw in your API key. So if this is your API key, you can see that the last four letters specifies your particular allocated data server. So I was allocated US number 18. And if you head over to this website, status.mailchimp.com, you can see how that server is performing. So let's find our US 18 API. And you can see that it's been up 100% the time. It's been performing pretty well. And in fact, all of the data servers are doing pretty well. And it's simply just a way for them to spread the load amongst all of their data servers. So if we head back to our subscribe documentation, now that we know what our list ID is and which server we got allocated, then we can start piecing together this URL. So let's paste that in here. And I'm going to delete their default list, and I'm going to replace it with the list ID that corresponds to the list that we created. And then I'm going to change the US X and replace the X with whatever number I got allocated, which is number 18. So let's add that here. So my final URL looks something like this: https us18.api.mailchimp.com /3.0 /list the list ID. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing that we need to do is to change our request method, because the default method is a get, and we need to post this data that the user is putting into these fields to MailChimp. So we're going to change the method from get to post. Now, once a user clicks on the submit button, then the form is going to try and make a post request to our home route, which will get caught in this section here. And once our code lands in this section, it's going to create these options, and then it's going to call the function request to make this post request to MailChimp's servers. And it's going to look inside the options object to see where it needs to go and what method it needs to request with. Now, once that's completed, then the callback function gets triggered, and we need to look to see if there were any errors. So if error, then we're going to log the error. But else, if there's no error, then we're going to log the status code that we get back from MailChimp servers. And we can access that from response.status code. And just do a last minute check to make sure that you don't have any typos like what I have over here. So in my request, I'm trying to pass in this object called options, but I've actually called my object option. So I need to make sure that they are exactly the same, because otherwise I'll get some errors. So if you've made sure that there are no problems at all, you've called your URL, method is method, and our request passes in options and has a callback with some if and else statements, then it's time to hit save and try out our website. So I'm going to use my name, and then I'm going to use my testing email, 1@2.com, and then I'm going to hit sign me up. And now our website is going to hang, but this is the time to check our console. And you can see that we're getting a code back, and this is the HTTP status code that we printed over here. So if this code got triggered, then it means that we didn't get any error from making the request, but we got sent a code back from MailChimp's servers. And if we want to know what that code means, then we can go to http://statuses.com and we can try and find our code, which is 401. So 401 means that the request has not been applied because it lacks valid authentication credentials for the target resource. So 401 basically means that you are not allowed to make the request, whether if it's a post request or a get request. So say if you were trying to access the Pentagon server and you wanted to grab some piece of data in a get request, then you might get this 401 unauthorized. And in our case, we were trying to post data to our MailChimp list without providing our API key, which is why we got that unauthorized message. So let's go ahead and fix that. Now, in order to make sure that we are authorized, then we're going to have to provide our API key. Now, if we take a look at the documentation and get started guide, you can see that they have a section on authentication. And they're telling you that there are two authentication methods for the API. One is basic authentication and the other one is OAuth 2. Now, we're going to talk about OAuth in later modules because it's a complicated beast. But luckily, we can also use the basic authentication, and it's going to be more than sufficient for our needs. So MailChimp says that you can enter any string as your username and supply your API key as the password, and that your HTTP client library should have built-in support for basic authentication. And this is an example of how you can authenticate yourself using curl. In our case, we're using request. Now, the documentation on request on basic HTTPS authentication is not all that great. But as always, we still have Google, right? So let's search for how we can do an HTTP basic authentication using Node and request. And there's lots of ways that you can go about doing this. But the simplest way of authenticating is to simply provide a headers section that is simply going to be an object that we're going to pass along. And one of those objects is going to be called authorization. Remember to spell it with a Z because everything is in American English. And the authorization is going to be a string, where the first part is, as MailChimp said, any string. So we'll just call it Angela1. And then the second part is going to be our password, which is the API key. So that is our API key. And there's a single space between the two of them. So this is the way that you can authorize yourself using basic HTTP authorization and the request module for any API, not just MailChimp's. And similar to these initial bits of code where we use body parser URL encoded or express.static, This is something that you get used to using. And in later modules, we'll talk about OAuth, which is the sort of more bells and whistles way of authorizing not just yourself, but also other users. And we'll look into this in more detail. But for now, this is more than sufficient in order to authorize ourselves and identify ourselves with the MailChimp server. So let's hit save and let's try that form again. And let's see what problem we might encounter this time. So here is the user that wants to sign up to my newsletter again. And when I click sign me up, we can check our console and you can see that we're getting back a different status code. So at least it's not the same one, right? So let's again head over to HTTP statuses and check what a 400 is. So the 400 code means that the server cannot or will not process the request due to something that is perceived to be a client error. So remember previously we said that any status code that begins with 4 means that you screwed up. So it can be due to a malformed request syntax or an invalid message framing or deceptive request routing. Wow, that sounds really crazy here. But basically, the problem is that we're making a post request that has been sufficiently authorized to this URL, but we're not providing any data to post to their servers. We're missing the crucial part, which is the body of our post request. So if you head over to the request documentation, you can see that it has an option for specifying the body of your post request. And the key is simply called body. And this is how you can specify your post request body. And it has to be a string. So let's go ahead and use this to send our data over. Now, if you take a look at the MailChimp documentation on how you subscribe members, you can see that inside the request body, they have a parameter called members. And this is an array of objects, each representing an email address and the subscription status. So inside the example, you can see that they've got this object, which is represented here in JSON format, and the parent object has a key of members, and the value is an array of all the emails that you want to sign up. And they have an email as well as a status of subscribed. So in our case, we're going to use the JSON stringify method that we saw previously to turn our JavaScript object into a JSON. But first, let's make our data JavaScript object. So I'm going to create a variable called data, and this is going to be a JavaScript object. So we open up our curly braces and we specify the first parameter name, which has to be called members. And it has to be called members because this is the only way that MailChimp is going to recognize and knows what to do with the data that we're going to put in here. So again, let's remind ourselves, members has to be an array of objects. So in order to create an array, we have our square brackets. And in order to create our objects, we have our curly braces. So here we have an array of objects. Now, in our case, we only have one object because we only want to subscribe one person at a time. Say if we wanted to subscribe lots of people, then we would have an array of lots of objects, each containing the emails and the names and the statuses of everybody we want to subscribe. But in this case, there's only one person. Now, inside this members array, we can have a bunch of other things, such as the email address and the status. So we still have to follow this format that they have specified, just so that when this data gets over there, they'll know what to do with the values. So the email address is going to be equal to the email address that the user entered in the form. So we'll just say email address is email. And the next one that is required is the status, which has to be the subscriber's current status. So we want to change it to subscribed. So you can also unsubscribe somebody by changing the status to unsubscribed. But in cases of new entries, it's always going to be subscribed. So status is a string that has to be lowercase, and it's going to read subscribed. Okay, so here's our first member that we're going to add. And this currently is a JavaScript object. Now, as we mentioned before, in order to turn a real-life JavaScript object into a Flatpak JSON, then we can simply use the method called json.stringify. And we're going to stringify this data object. And then we're going to store it into a variable called JSON data. Now that we have this variable, then we can go into our options and create a new option that's called body. And that, of course, comes from here, which is going to be the body of our post request. So this is the data that we're actually posting. That's what comes inside this body part. And the data that we're posting is this JSON data. So now we've got authorization and we've got content and we've specified how we want our request to be processed and the URL that we want to send our request to, then it's finally time to check our website and see if we can sign up this new user. So let's click sign me up, and inside our console, we're getting a status code of 200. So again, same thing, go to HTTP statuses. At some point, you're going to get really used to these numbers and they're going to start making sense to you just as much as the 404 does for people. Everybody knows that 404 means not found, but there's all these other codes that nobody knows about. So 200 is your best friend. 200 means okay, which means that the request has succeeded. The external server accepted your request and they're finally happy with us. So now that means if we head over to our lists and click on our list, then you can see we have a new subscriber. And this is our brand new fan of our newsletter who is going to be so chuffed about receiving our newsletter because our code finally works. All right, so that was pretty cool. But what about the other fields? What about the first name and the last name? Well, why didn't they get passed over? Well, that is of course because we have neglected our jobs as programmers. When we passed in the data to MailChimp, we only included the email address that the user entered, and we didn't pass over the first name and the last name. Now, if we wanted to include those in here, then we have to again check the MailChimp documentation. You can see that under this parameter called members, there's properties called email address and status, which we've used. But there's also a property called merge fields. And these are individual merge fields for a particular member. Now, what are merge fields? Well, they are basically these tags that you can add into your email so that you can personalize your email. So whenever you've received an email that says, "Dear Angela, please buy this and this and this and this, sale now on," there isn't somebody who's actually writing all of these emails for you and putting in everybody's name. No, they're using merge fields. So if you go to settings, list fields and merge tags on MailChimp, you can see that there's a whole bunch of things that you can use as merge fields. So you can add in the user's email, or you can add in their first name and last name. And these are the most commonly used merge fields. So you can say, "Dear Angela Yu, this is a sales message." But more importantly for us, we can see the name of these merge fields, and they are all caps, F name and L name. And that's what we're going to be using combined with the merge field property in order to send those pieces of data over. Now, if you take a look down here at an example, you can see that they've done it like so. So the property is called merge fields, and inside they've got F name, L name, and other merge fields. So this is exactly the same structure that we're going to be using in our code to send over the first name and last name as well. So in addition to email address and status, we're also going to have our merge fields. And this is going to be an object with two merge fields. One is the F name, and the second is the L name. And just to remind you, this comes from our merge fields for our list. And if you can, of course, change this and save your changes to specify a different parameter here. And you can also have some custom ones. Say if you wanted to know, do you like cats? You can have a merge field for that, and you can target it in your code. But in our case, we just want to pass over the first name and the last name that we obtained from our form. And now if I hit save and test my app again, and you can see I can actually pass in my full name. So now I've hit the sign me up button. MailChimp's server is responding with the code 200, so everything is A-OK. And we can now go into our lists and see that we have a brand new subscriber. And this subscriber comes complete with a first name and last name. Pretty awesome, right? We're building up a pretty large list now. So this newsletter better be fantastic. Now, currently, you can see that our website actually hangs when we press the sign me up button. So it would be really nice in terms of user experience if it didn't do that. If instead we could provide them some feedback about how it went, because they can't look into the console and see whether if it went well or if it went badly. So we have to be responsible web developers in order to give them some feedback. So in the next lesson, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to be providing some feedback through the use of two other pages. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.